Hey, today what we're going to do is begin our two-part look at the self. So, like I did with the last chapter, we'll be splitting the chapter up into two different class periods and kind of breaking it down accordingly to each. So, the self can be distinguished from identity because we start to get into the person as more of an actor in the sense that, she is cognitively aware of kind of who she is, what she's doing, how she's doing it. And so you get kind of the self concepts and the mental and behavioral connections to one's mental makeup. So that's how we can really kind of distinguish the self from identity. Identity, you can think, is kind of the label that we attach to ourselves, we attach to others. The sense of a self is one kind of playing out these identities. And again, as we'll see here in a second, it captures the kind of reflexive process of kind of thinking back, and then also the overall kind of idea of we do have these concepts of self, and these self concepts kind of connect to the consciousness streams, how we think, how we act in a given situation based upon the self that's emerging, the self that's playing out. So we can say that, like identity, these senses of self are created through social interaction. You kind of enter these roles, you take on this new sense of self, and over time, you kind of learn, how to approach it, both mentally speaking, how to approach it in terms of one's action as well. Um, Again, kind of that the tradition of going back to the fluidity within symbolic interaction. We see that again here with the self. How the self changes over time. It changes place to place, and so on the one hand, it's fluid, that you kind of have a new sense of self emerge every time you enter a new role. So when I'm teaching, it's my kind of professor self that's kind of dominating the way I think and the way I act. But when I go, home, after class ends, I enter kind of the husband self. So I think not as the professor anymore, but I think more as kind of a partner, as a husband. And so the self is fluid, and we have these multiple selves, and each one kind of relates to different ways of thinking, different ways of acting, but even kind of the same role, the same self kind of evolves over time. I wasn't the same teacher, when I first started, compared to how I approach it in both in behavior and thought today. And the same thing with other roles. Other roles kind of evolve over time. And so, kind of getting back to some of the ideas I was touched on, kind of multiple selves, and how the kind of roles kind of shape how we think and how we act. And this goes back to George Herbert Mead's concepts of the I and me. So if you've taken my social theory class, you probably are familiar with this, or hopefully at least rings a bell. And so Mead believed that everybody possesses these two concepts. Basically, they're in our minds, our social cognition. The concept of the me represents kind of the role that we're playing and these social expectations that are attached to the role. And then the I is another concept, and the I captures kind of the playing of the role, um, trying to meet the prescribed expectations of what you're supposed to be doing kind of in the role you find yourself in. So we say that, the me, the social identity part, the role itself kind of tells you what to do. And then the I basically is you trying to achieve those expectations. So basically, the role and playing the role, and the two kind of work back and forth to create and maintain a sense of self. And so, here we can go back to the idea of a teacher. So, the teacher, it would be the me. It's a role that has social expectations attached to it. You're supposed to uh, teach effectively. You're supposed to assess students. You're supposed to be prepared in terms of getting things ready for class, for assignments. And, so those are the expectations that you kind of learn when you step into the role. And then the teaching part, the assigning part, the grading part. So kind of the playing out the role would be kind of the I in action. So we kind of need both sides of the coin for the self to come together. Because if you don't know the expectations attached to the role, you're going to be, all over the place. If you are not fulfilling the expectations of the role, you're only kind of the role by name itself, but not by actually doing the responsibilities. So, for example, I could be teaching you anything. Uh, I could talk about my dog for 20 minutes, and you'd be like, oh, he's teaching my social psych class, but he's not really teaching it. So, I'm a teacher by label, but not through my action. So that's why, Mead says we all kind of learn through socialization the role, the expectations attached to it, and we internalize those expectations and make it part of our me. And then our I is when we emit our action, our behaviors to match the expectations. And so, the I captures not only the doing of the role, but it also captures the human agency, kind of their free will, where all teachers have to perform the same duties, but we perform those duties differently. You can put your own little spin, your own little fashion on it. So here we start to see, the self being socially informed. The social world prescribes you kind of the expectations of your role, whether it be a parent, husband, a teacher, a student. So you don't get to, decide what the role is, but you can actually decide how you want to play it out. And so you can your kind of personal fashion on your role. Although you all have multiple teachers, they're all doing the same thing, but they do it differently. So it captures that kind of free will, the agency, when you really focus on the I part, the doing, rather than the me part, kind of the socially prescribed aspect of our senses of self. So Mead also believed that you try to match your I, the behavior, to the me, the expectations attached to the role, because the better you are kind of fulfilling expectations, the better you are matching your behavior to how people expect you to act in that role, the less psychological tension you experience. So you have a peace of mind, you have cognitively speaking, at ease when you're fulfilling expectations. So I just recently recorded a lecture for my social theory class that we're talking about this, and I brought up the example that when I leave a classroom having felt that everything went well, the lecture went well, students were paying attention, students were really getting it. You could tell, basically my actions to teaching met the expectations of a teacher to teach effectively. So when everything comes together, you have that peace of mind. You feel good. You sleep like a baby that night. But on the other hand, there's some classes where I can just tell that things aren't going well. I'm doing my best to teach, but I can tell that the learning is not happening. Students are confused. Students don't know what to think. And so, those times, my actions didn't meet the expectations. I wasn't teaching very effectively if nobody was learning. And so those nights are where, that psychological tension emerges. You get restless, you have, uneasy cognitive mindsets, and, you can't sleep at night. And so, that's what Mead basically says. He says, we try our best to, adapt to the environment. We try our best to adapt to the role we find ourselves in, because the better we are at it, the better basically we feel. And so we can look at, so what happens if I don't meet expectations in a role? So, one thing that happens is basically you have to practice. You have to practice at teaching better. You have to practice at, taking the tests, writing your papers better to meet the expectations imposed upon you, as a college student, as a professor. In addition to practicing, so you can meet those expectations, minimize the tension, you can minimize the importance of the role to you. So, if you say, well, I don't, like this class anyways, it doesn't really mean anything to me, I'm just doing it because I have to. And then you start to minimize the amount of attention you'll get because you really distance yourself from the role. So it's not going to bother you as much compared to if the role really does mean something to you. That's when a lot more tension would emerge. And so, I don't really care about teaching this class. I don't care about taking this class. And when you create that distance between yourself and the role, the tension that you'd experience when not meeting expectations would be lower compared to otherwise. And then the third option is when you simply leave the role. So you drop out of school, you withdraw from a class, you go find a new job. So like I said before, when I go over this, it's basically a third option usually is problematic because you need your college degree. You need to pay the rent. So you want to keep your job, you want to keep your student role, but you'll kind of minimize the importance of it to you or use practice. You go to tutoring, you go into the writing center, so on and so on, so you can do better in the classroom. Or again, you practice as an instructor. You find new ways to deliver information so the learning can be done more effectively. So we can get into the self as a social structure. And basically, as a social structure, it becomes something kind of bigger than simply that kind of identity you were getting at in the last chapter of the book. The way we define ourselves influences kind of how we think and how we act in situations. And so, Goffman, and a lot of you in your questions on the last section of the second chapter talked about dramaturgy and Goffman, and a lot of you found that interesting. So here's kind of getting into that a little bit, kind of the role we take on and the self-concept that emerges in a given situation. It really kind of influences how we're thinking, how we're acting in that situation. So for example, when I come home, the professor self-concept basically becomes minimized, and what becomes salient at the time is becoming the husband. So I act differently, I speak differently when I'm at home compared to when I'm on campus in that professor role. And so kind of the hat you put on, the role you put on does kind of influence, how you're thinking in that situation. Am I going to be thinking as a professor or thinking as a husband? Or, it's also going to influence how I act in a given situation as well. So, if I say something to my wife and she doesn't get it, I'm probably going to leave it at that. But if I say something to a student and they don't get it, I'll try to re-explain it, and so they finally will get it. Because again, it's a different situation, student-teacher relationship compared to two partners living together. So you can see that in Goffman's kind of theory of kind of give these performances, and the performances we give are kind of shaped by the role itself, the script that we attach to the role. And Goffman did a lot of interesting work on what he called role confusion. So sometimes you enter a situation where you kind of have two roles becoming salient at the same time. And so, often I'll, run into students, whether it be like at a restaurant or, at a grocery store. And it gets kind of awkward on both ends because, at a grocery store, for example, we're both, consumers. Or if at a restaurant, I have a student who's waiting on my table, you're no longer my student in that situation. You're now my, worker, my, waiter. And so it gets kind of odd because should I act like the professor or should I act like the customer or the consumer? And the same thing from students, we're out of the classroom. Should I still act towards them like I would act towards them on campus, student to teacher? Or, when I wait his table, should I just treat him as the customer? So, Goffman does a lot of interesting kind of fun stuff, looking at these roles that we take on. And sometimes it's not so black and white when the role confusion actually emerges. And so we can say the stronger one's self-concept, the more it influences their thoughts and action. So we kind of have this, vertical ordering of your self-concepts. And the ones that are at the top that mean the most to you are going to be the most influential on you. And so basically we call this the identity salience. So identity salience can be like two things. On the one hand, we say an identity is salient, a sense of self-concept is salient when it's kind of there on top. You're playing out that role. Your other identities, your other self-concepts are kind of in the background. But also identity salience in general are kind of the identities that are kind of emerging the most, kind of most influential on you. And so, everybody has multiple roles, multiple senses of self throughout their life, but some are more important, some are more significant compared to others. And that kind of variation of significance will kind of mirror the variation of how influential that self concept actually is. So, kind of the last angle of self in this first part of the chapter we can look at is self esteem. And so, here we're looking at kind of self esteem as being a product of three different avenues, avenues through which the self esteem can fluctuate, can stay the same. So basically, what is this idea, and how do we kind of measure it, or how do we understand self-esteem? So in general, kind of self-esteem is basically how you are evaluating your overall kind of sense of self, with a capital S, or how you evaluate your sense of self in terms of self with a lowercase s. Excuse me, a sense of self that's more specific in terms of being a professor versus being kind of Ryan as a person in general. So, the book basically says there's just three different things we can look at that kind of go into these evaluations of self. We can look at reflected appraisals. And basically, this is how we evaluate the evaluations of others. So, so how do I evaluate, student feedback in terms of, do I see myself as a good teacher? Do I feel good about that sense of self? And how do I evaluate the feedback I get from my colleagues? And those two different evaluations, which matters more to me, the student evaluations of my teaching or my colleagues' evaluations of my teaching. And so, again, we kind of balance all these things out, and some things carry more weight than others when it comes to actually kind of influencing how I kind of feel, for better or worse, in a kind of given situation, a given sense of self, or just in general. So often you would say, going back to Charles Cooley and his ideas of primary and secondary groups, kind of the primary groups are more influential on you. So you'd say that you care more about how your parents evaluate you than you would perhaps a coworker. And so they both would give you feedback you would use to kind of feel good or maybe not, but the coworker's feedback is going to have less strength compared to the weight of feedback of a parent usually has. So also we do social comparison. So, it's interesting when we talk about social comparison because there are these, two schools of thought, which I think actually are both correct. They can coexist at once, but they kind of contradict one another. The book touched upon self-enhancement. So there's this kind of motive when we talk about kind of core social psychological motives. We talk often about these two things when we get into kind of feeling in control, but also kind of self-enhancing to feel good. So you basically self-enhance by comparing yourself to reference points and that make you look good. So, you just kind of do things that make you kind of feel above other people and better than other people. And so when when you're self-enhancing, usually you're using kind of a downward social comparison. You're using a reference point that's kind of in terms of ordering, it's kind of a lower level than you. And so when you self-enhance, you typically you do feel good as a result. Or on the other hand, when you do want to feel good, you practice that self-enhancing. So social comparison in that manner, kind of you compare yourself to others that would make you feel good at the end of the day. But the other school of thought is, and if you're in my theory class, or you have been, this is what Thorstein Valen talked about, is how people kind of, he believes by nature, and just have this, we have this kind of pattern of, always using upward comparisons. So that's why, we always want kind of more, and it's never enough. We want more money, more of this, because we always kind of compare ourselves to people that have more than us. So again, the two schools of thought, we have this motive of self-enhancing, but also people typically will compare themselves to people that have more. And then when you compare yourself to, people that have more, the upward comparison, that's typically when you kind of feel, worse at the end of the day. this person is a much better teacher than I am, compared to if I look at somebody who doesn't teach well and be like, "Ugh," then I feel kind of better as a result of that. So the third avenue in terms of how self-esteem is kind of created and how it changes over time looks at self-efficacy. And so here, basically, it's about being able to feel like you're in control of the situation, uh, that you're competent at kind of what you're doing at any given time. So, again, basically, the rule of thumb is the more in control you feel, the more competent you are, and kind of the higher levels of self efficacy, the better you're going to feel. And then the opposite would be the lower levels of efficacy, um, the more out of control you feel, the more incompetent you feel, the kind of worse off you're going to be in terms of how you feel about yourself. And so, again, it varies situation to situation depending on how salient that self concept is to you. So, I just started for the first time playing in the fantasy football league, and let's just say it's not going very well. But so I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, but it's not really that big a deal to me. But on the other hand, if I kind of feel like I'm not doing my teaching well, that does bother me. Those situations do kind of turn into that psychological tension that Mead talks about, compared to, if you're playing in a fantasy football league, you should know more or less what you're doing. And I feel like I don't. So, my behavior, my eye is not matching, the expectations of a fantasy football player. But that doesn't really bother me because, that part of myself, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't have that much weight. So again, everything's kind of depends upon the situation and the self in the situation. But here we can nicely kind of understand how self-esteem is created and how it's recreated when we start to look at these three different paths through which people are kind of evaluating oneself and kind of judging them, emotionally speaking, based upon kind of where they stand in comparison to the evaluations of others, in comparison to kind of other people in terms of the comparisons, or simply if you feel in control or if you feel competent within that self concept, within that role. So we'll leave that there and kind of continue to look at the self and the second half of the chapter. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out and let me know.